Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Invisible Histories Project Talks, a series where, as the title suggests, we talk with super cool folks doing really amazing work across the country, particularly in queer and trans archiving, history, and community organizing. I'm Megan Sullivan, she, her, hers, and I'm here with my colleague,
Josh Burford, he, him, his.
And we are so excited to have some folks here from the Gerber Hart Library and Archives in Chicago. If y'all would take time and introduce yourselves, tell us your name, your pronouns, what you do, any other fun facts about you that we should know, maybe your favorite animal, I don't know. We haven't had people in a while, so just make some stuff up.
Man.
James, you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm Chen Dentel, and I've been volunteering at Gerber Hart, I think, for about 6 years at this point. And I started working there part-time last September as their communications and programming coordinator. So yeah, I favorite animal, man, that is, I'm gonna think, I'm not sure. Tigers come to mind only because I've been watching recently.
We all know what that is.
The Office, clearly. Watching The Office.
Well, I'll jump in. I'm James Conley. I'm currently, I work for Loyola University in Chicago as a media librarian, and I work in some film studies stuff. But I've been volunteering at the Gerber Hart Library with Jen and Alyssa for, God, I think I've been there like 4.5, 5 years now. And in addition to, I guess rather than favorite animal, I guess I'll tell you sort of like my favorite thing about being there, in addition to being my media librarian self and organizing the entire collection of erotica videos in the archives, which was a fun, painstaking project. And you can actually get too tired of looking at, pictures of sexy people. But I also am on the exhibits group there. So I've done a couple of exhibits on queer history for library with Jen and with Alyssa. So yeah, it's been awesome.
My name is Alyssa Sadusky. I am the baby of this group. I have been with Gerber Hart for about 2 years. I started off as a practicum student and then was lucky enough to do some grant writing for Gerber Hart. And this past, I believe, December, I was brought on as the resident archivist. So really excited to do complete a whole bunch of projects with Gerber Hart. And I am on the curating team with James Conley as well. So yeah, just a really exciting time. As far as favorite animal goes, before the plague hit, I did also work for the local zoo here in Chicago, the Lincoln Park Zoo. And my favorite animal would have to be gorillas. They are amazing, amazing creatures. Oh, and she, her, hers are my pronouns.
I forgot as well. I got so distracted by the favorite animals. So she, her, hers.
And he, him, his.
I always like to put a little bit of ridiculousness in it. Thank you, James, for bringing awareness by doing your very real answer and put that in there for me. Appreciate that. But I had a feeling about the zoo. We'll just call it a feeling. We'll go with it.
Well, my favorite animal is a turtle. It always has been. I love turtles. I'm obsessed with them. Before we get started, cheers, everyone, to our happy hour conversation.
Cheers.
Here in the Deep South, 4 o'clock does count as happy hour. Just yeah.
I mean, our prices are pretty happy hour regardless of what time you are by comparison, but they're real cheap right now.
So I guess for people who don't really know, like, give us the nuts and bolts about Gerber Hart. Like, where are you? What do you do? How old are you? Like, what's your deal? What's your archive deal?
You want me to take a first stab at it? I can.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So we started in 1981. So kind of started mainly because we needed a place where people could donate their materials when they were passing away of the AIDS crisis. So that was a big reason why we were founded. So we're a circulating library, and then we have an archives and a special collections as well. So with the exception of, our director, and now Alyssa and I were entirely volunteer run. So we process a lot of archival collections. We have, this really great circulating library where people can come in and check out all of these great LGBTQ books. Our archives mainly focuses on the LGBTQ history of Chicago and the Midwest. So we have a lot of fascinating collections. In the last couple of years, we've started doing exhibits. So like as James and Alyssa mentioned, we've done these big exhibits on, drag in Chicago and pre-Stonewall activism, lesbians and feminism. There's been some really incredible exhibits where we've been able to use our archival materials and put these exhibits on and get people into our space. So I think we've started doing a lot more programming and we're reaching more people. I think we're having more of a social media presence online and more people are hearing about us, which is great. So we've been around a long time and there's definitely been periods where we haven't been as visible or as open, but I think we're on an upward trend now, which has been really great to see.
Well, and can you tell us a little bit about who you're named after? Because I feel like I know, but maybe other people should probably know who that is.
Okay. Great follow-up question. Yeah, I mean, Henry Gerber and Pearl Hart. So Henry Gerber started the first official gay rights. All right, so yes, good follow-up question. Henry Gerber and Pearl Hart are who we're named after. So Henry Gerber started the first official gay rights group in the US, I believe in the 20s. Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I think it was 1924.
Right.
24, yeah.
That sounds right. And then Pearl Hart was a incredible attorney in Chicago who was a lesbian attorney. She was not out at the time, but she fought for gay people that have been caught up in bar raids, for people that were immigrants. She fought for women that had been taken in on prostitution charges. She was just all around incredible activist. So we're named after those two.
How much of Henry Gerber's materials actually survived from the 20s?
Gosh, not much. I mean, we have copies of some of the documents, like when he was fired from the post office for being outed. And we have a copy of the charter that was issued for the Society of Human Rights. But there's not much original materials that we have. I don't know, James and Alyssa, if you can think of anything else. We always have kids coming in for the history fair that want to do research on Henry Gerber and look at primary sources. So we have some copies of things we can show them, but there's not a lot of original material left for him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
yeah,
I would agree. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we have copies of like one or two, I mean, kind of famous, often used headshots of him. But yeah, we don't have a lot of materials. We have, I mean, obviously, the great thing is that there's a fair bit of research on him. So for our past exhibits, we've been able to delve into, other publications and things like that. But it is unfortunate that we don't have, unfortunately, like, a box full of his stuff,
Yeah. Well, as a Southern side note about his original work in the 20s, in 1991 in Charlotte, a radical political group was formed to advocate for an inclusive anti-discrimination statement, which they based on Henry Gerber's original organization. And they were called Society for Human Rights. They even took the name.
That's amazing.
Yeah. There's a really amazing picture of them standing in front of the courthouse, like with their hands in the air with this interesting mix of like business owners and doctors and like radical lesbian bookstore owners, like doing this.
That's incredible.
Well, Alyssa, tell us a little bit about the archives. Like, what kind of materials, do you all have? Are you super heavy in one particular area, like manuscripts or t-shirts? Like, what do you got?
Yeah, sure. So we have a lot of varied materials in our archive. A lot of it is obviously paper materials. A lot of the donations are in linear feet. And yeah, I think the total linear foot number is like 150, 200. And the collections are pretty varied. Obviously, a lot of it is post-Stonewall, but we do have some pre-Stonewall collections as well. Lots of super interesting stuff. T-shirt collections, we've got our mixed media collection where we've got records and cassette tapes, and there's lots of good stuff in there. I'm really excited to just continue to go through it and learn about it. I feel like every time I go in, I pick up a new box and I learn something new about what we have back there. There's so much to go through. And there's so much backlog processing to do that we're really excited to start to get done. And it's been really exciting since Jen and I have been brought on as sort of retainers, how much we're learning about the collections together and all the social media postings that Jen has been doing. It's really been exciting to bring the things that we're finding out every day in the archives to the general public. So that's been super, super exciting. Yeah, as far as things that the collection's lacking, I mean, our collection is obviously very focused on white cis stories. And I would love, as we become more ingrained in our local community and expand our reach on social media, to really search out those stories from trans and non-binary individuals, queer people of color. You know, we need to expand what we have in our archive so that we can be good retainers of like the stories that we're bringing to the public. So really excited about sort of what the future will hold. Obviously post-plague, but we'll make sure to continue to do great stuff during the interim.
James, can you tell me a lot more about this filthy media that you've been watching?
Yeah, so it's funny when I when I started at the Gerber Hart, you know, obviously I had this kind of oddly specific skill set of, you know, media librarianship, and there aren't a lot of media librarians with that specific title left out there. But it was really fun to come in and to see this like several thousand title large collection of VHS tapes, sometimes Betamax. If you were lucky, they were on DVDs. You know, but all of these, it's funny when people pass or people are looking to get rid of a lot of their personal papers and things like that, and they want to donate them. I think in many non-queer archives, they would be surprised to receive like erotica materials, because you're like, was that really telling much of a story? But you know, for a lot of queer history, I mean, our sexuality and our sex is tied to a lot of that, and our representation, how we represent ourselves, that, you know, was sort of an early outlet for us in many ways. I mean, even if you look at, you know, some of the homophile organizations from the 60s, like the Janus Society, like they went out and published erotica magazines back then. You know, it's this reclaiming of sexuality and this pride in sexuality. So we've got this fun collection. When I started there was, everything was organized more or less by title, but we had no idea what we had. So you'd get, you know, every Thursday night, somebody would come in with a giant moving box full of like porn cassette tapes. And then you had no idea if you already had it in the collection. So, you know, being the good little cataloger that I have been, I started a database for us to record all of that so that, you know, we could make it easier for people who want to donate, you know, so they know what we have already. So they're not lugging in big stuff, but also to make it easier for us, especially as we're planning for, you know, space and expansion, because we are running out of space, like any archive is. And so we need to be mindful of that. But it was a wild ride, I'll tell you that. You know, when you have to, if you get 2 copies, you want to keep the one that's in the best condition. And so then you load up the old VHS player and you pop them in, and, you know, aside from some of the extraordinarily amusing titles, and I'm sure Jen, Alyssa, and I all have 3 probably favorite different titles that we've come up with or come across. The ads at the beginning of some of these tapes are hilarious and just wild. Yeah. But you know, it's an interesting historical record of tastes, predilections, and definitely non-PC things from our history when it comes to sex. There's a lot of shocking stuff in there sometimes, but you know.
Well, I just wonder how long we're gonna have to be alive before like all of that 90s print porn that was, I mean, they were cranking it out by the truckloads, like Freshman and all those like weird magazines. I wonder how long we'll have to wait before those magazines become the physique pictorial that those are now for us. Because we get something from the 50s, no matter how ridiculous it is, we keep it.
Yeah.
But someone brings us a magazine from 2000 and we're like, yikes, we don't need that.
Ooh, that's porn. And like, yeah, some of it is just porn, but it's, and not to get super soapboxy, but like the asexualization of queer people is such an assimilist nonsense move. As like, you know, and I say this a lot, like folks don't hate us because of who we love, because people love lots of people. They hate us because of who we fuck. And to exclude that from history is very harmful and erasing of, you know, a lot of the violence and a lot of the organizing. So yeah, organize your porn. Also, tell us the names. We need to hear at least one.
Okay. All right, Jen, I'm gonna take. I have to. I don't know if this is your favorite too. My favorite is definitely because it's elegant and also just gross at the same time. Splendor in the ass.
Oh, oh, that's so good.
It's just like it's wild. It's wild.
I mean, it's better than, you know, not Splendor, I guess. So.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
I was just in the special collections right before Gerber Hart closed, and I was looking at the erotica, and I'm trying to figure out, we went through a whole bunch of them. We do have a selection of Harry Potter themed ones, all revolving around chambers of secrets and snakes and things. That one sticks out in my mind.
I think the one that made me laugh the most, aside from Splendor in the Ass, because that one, there was one that we got that was it's a long one. It's a Butt Munch to Back to the Crack. But I think it's interesting, like what you said about when it becomes something worth collecting. Because I think about, like, I collect all these 1950s and 60s pulp novels, which were trash at the time. Like, you just read it and then throw it away on a bus. But at some point they became something valuable to people to collect. So at what point does it become important? And I think that's so interesting in the archives, trying to figure out what do we need to keep, because I think we have so many volunteers that work on erotica and grow to hate it because there's just so much of it, and then you get so much that's all seems the same, and it's really frustrating to keep looking at. But I think it's hard to know, how is this going to be used in the future? How is this going to be important?
You know, very early on in Invisible Histories, I went to pick up a collection, and it was described to me by the donor as a, quote, large media collection. And so I just drove to pick it up, and I walked into a room, and it was, I guess it had been a dining room. It was floor to ceiling. And he said, these are all gay magazines. So it was like original copies of The Advocate when it used to be a newspaper.
Wow.
A ton of stuff. And I was digging through it. There was a gay truckers newsletter in there that used to be circulated at truck stops.
Yeah.
And so I was like, wow, this is
awesome.
Oh, it's so good. We'll have to digitize it and send it to you. It's really, really good.
That's amazing.
But he takes me to this other room, and it's also floor to ceiling. And I picked a magazine up, and I said, oh, so this is porn. And I said, how much of this is porn? And he said, all of it. And it was probably 500-600 magazines. And like you said, like, how do you decide what to keep? Because we can't take 600 porn magazines in the collection.
Right.
Like, what do we do with it?
It's impressive to me how much money some of the, like the VHS tapes, some of them still have price tags on them, and like each tape was, you know, $40 back in the 80s. You know, it's like, that's incredible how much money these things were worth at the time, because it was so rare. But that's an impressive collection. That's
yeah.
The one thing that we did keep out of that was that he kept, you know, those boxes that you get like long legal envelopes in from the Office Depot, just kind of long ones with the top on it. He kept 7 or 8 of those full of the order forms that he would get in the mail. And so we kept all of them because it's so interesting to look at like how long they lasted and like where they were coming from. And we always think of it as like coming from California or New York, but there was a lot of small presses in the Midwest and places like that where they were like, you know, we'll send you these magazines. And that was such a treasure to find in the midst of all that, you know, mess, because I'd never seen a collection like that before. It's actually quite cool at the end of the day.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
Well, I
Those
think
that's one of those gems where, you come across it and it's so unassuming at first, but then it has these amazing little tidbits of history that, because the collection's so complete, it gives you such a better picture.
Yeah.
So it's awesome to find people that, the negativity of a typical pack rat. It's like, no, please keep everything, because then we have that full scan. Yeah.
well, and I think one of my favorite pieces sort of erotica that I've ever sort of handled at Gerber Hart were actually these old from the 70s, these 8mm reels that people were getting, and they were having shipped to them from these producers around the country. And it was this box of the stuff that, like, we didn't even know who the donor was. It was like somebody's friend of a friend of a friend, and then it got donated to us. And the titles weren't even on all the pieces. You'd actually have to like open the reels and sort of like try to look for the title card in them. But the most incredible part is that there were post-it notes on the insides of the boxes that held the reels, and they were like reviews by whoever had been watching them of the film. So it's like, hot twink, dad's kind of ugly, like XYZ, cum shot too fast, like it was like overall a 4.5 out of 10. And I was just like, this, and in like this perfect script, this beautiful, perfect handwriting. And I was just like, this is like this incredible encapsulation of how somebody actually used this title and how they organized, their own collection back in the day. I think it's great. But also, I think to the point of, the fact that like our sexuality is so integral to who we are in our history. I can only speak from my own experience, but I can say in the 5 or so years that I've been at Gerber Hart, just digging into that history and grappling with it, I really sort of changed my own personal identity. I recognize myself as a queer identifying individual rather than a gay man, because I found that I had a deeper understanding of what that meant to me. And through going through a lot of this material, I started to recognize like, oh, this is why monogamy didn't, ever really feel that real to me. And, you realize, oh, right, historically, if you look at most queer people, especially queer, male identified people, like people were meeting up in truck stops, and that was about all you could do, because to have any sort of connection outside of that where you could be seen and identified by other people was dangerous. So, I think it gives you a whole different handle on how sex actually informs who we are culturally in a really cool way.
What my personal queer historical obsession is queer spaces. And so I'm obsessed with the cataloging of these sort of sexual spaces, and how, to your point, like when I was first coming out in the early 90s, there was still, in the little town I was in, Alabama, it was called the Fruit Loop. And so you would go and drive around the Fruit Loop to meet people, ostensibly for sex, but there was such a sense of community in that environment where people would pull over, and like if someone new came along, people would be like, look out for that guy, we don't know who he is. And so this sense of like people looking out for each other in a purely sexual environment, but we weren't removed, the community wasn't removed from that. Like it was a part of that deal, which I think is a story you don't hear at all.
Yeah, in Chicago, I think the big sort of historical space was the Belmont Rocks, right? So it was sort of where Hollywood Beach is now, which is still like an LGBT beach in Chicago, but that sort of Belmont Rock space was a cruising ground, but it was a space of community before the police and the city started to break all that stuff up. But in the traveling exhibit Art AIDS America that was around a couple of years ago that toured the country, there were a lot of like really beautiful photographs by a local photographer, Doug Ishkar, of those rocks in the early 80s, and sort of recognizing that there were these beautiful communities of people. And yes, there was a sexual component to a lot of it, but it was also just this safe meeting space, like you were talking about. Everybody kind of knew everybody. And reflecting now that space is, for all intents and purposes, gone, half of that beach is a family beach. It's a very different environment these days. And also a lot of those folks, we lost to AIDS. So it's a time capsule of this beautiful community space where people took care of each other,
Yeah. Now, you guys were working on an exhibit that was supposed to open before this whole COVID nightmare happened. You want to tell folks about like what you guys were doing with that exhibit?
Yeah. James, do you want to take a little bit and then I'll take a little bit?
Sure. Sounds great. So Alyssa and I, as well as 3 other members, are working on an exhibit called Q, Activism at the Margins of Identity. And so it's specifically talking about Chicago, like queer Chicago in the 1990s. And it does extend sort of the end time is a little bit blurry, but essentially we're telling the story of queer organizations that are defining themselves as queer, and what does queer mean in the 1990s in Chicago, and how is that different from lesbian, gay? How does that create a new definition? What does that reclamation look like? It's more radical. A lot of it comes out of AIDS activism from the 80s, and it has a lot of footholds in the homophile movement and these post-Stonewall radical movements. It's definitely radical and anti-assimilationist, which is awesome. That's totally our jam. It's so fun to look at that. But we're looking at different facets like the organizations, the sort of entertainment elements of it. So we're looking at like the homo core and queer core movements. We're looking at this clash as queerness and as lesbian and gay specifically, but also some trans representation is starting to appear in the media, like how that conflicts with queer, this 90s definition of queer. So we're looking at this idea of like gay content that's produced for straight audiences versus queer content that's made for and by queer people, and a number of other things. So
so it's a very expansive topic that we were and still are excited to talk about. Obviously, things are so up in the air right now. The exhibit itself is probably going to go on at some point. We just don't know exactly when it's going to go up or to what extent it's going to stay up. But it was such an exciting thing to research and just dig our hands into. It started off. The brief was originally surrounding Queer Nation and Queer Nation Chicago. We had a few connections to the original founders of Queer Nation in Chicago. So that was exciting. We got a lot of materials from them, and oh gosh, it was really, really exciting to talk about. The anti-assimilationist spin was the most exciting thing for me. Was really excited to sort of see these, hear these voices that aren't necessarily broadcast too often, and for us to give them a space to be heard. So hopefully the exhibit will be up at some point and we'll be able to talk more about it, send stuff to you guys. Be really exciting.
Man, I mean, since we're just having this chat, I'm wondering too, like, has anyone ever thought about doing, like, you guys have this core exhibit that reflects your collection and reflects your locality for sure, but I wonder if there would be a way for us to like pull in other Queer Nation archives into something electronic that we could connect up, because we have connections to Queer Nation Houston, Queer Nation Atlanta, and my favorite Queer Nation chapter, which was in Columbia, South Carolina.
Oh.
Yeah, they did back in the mid 90s. Remember the whole Cracker Barrel incident when they fired that lesbian waitress, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Queer Nation did protests from Virginia all the way down to Alabama, like all along the I-85 corridor. But Queer Nation South Carolina did a protest called Bigots and Gravy, which is genius.
Yes.
Oh, that's man, awesome. I love this idea. I would love to see how we might be able to do that, because part of what we're trying to do with Invisible Histories, with the Queer History South network, we've got 13 states, we've got people doing different kinds of work, but we're trying to imagine the connectivity of our work outside of just like purely sharing materials, which is obviously what we want to do. But if we're building an exhibit, how do we connect that to, the work that's happening in all of our other states? So I'd love for us to brainstorm how we might bring in some of these other, because as you all well know, like all the Queer Nation chapters were local. And so, but they're doing similar activism just in very different places.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we found particularly interesting, and Alyssa, can fill in more on this, but when we were talking specifically about the Chicago chapter of Queer Nation, oftentimes, what's written about in literature often focuses on the New York chapter, right?
Right.
Because New York is really big and stuff like that. But one of the things that we found to be pretty troubling about the New York chapter is that it was fairly trans exclusionary, and it was pretty racist as a movement. It also wasn't super welcoming to bisexual identifying individuals. And so Chicago's was a lot more, I think, inclusive in that ways. And that was an intentional part of the founders for the Chicago chapter. So it's been an interesting blend of, this primary research, talking to people who were alive, who were in that movement, looking at the materials that they were producing, and then looking at what little research and literature is out there now. I think one of the more complex things about researching this exhibit is that, unlike a lot of our past exhibits that I've worked on, a lot of the people who were part of the movement are still alive, so they haven't donated their materials anywhere yet. There hasn't been extensive research and publication on this specific set of movements yet. So we're really delving in and doing a lot of it for the first time, it feels like, which is exciting because it feels like, hey, we can present something really new that, everyone has already been exposed to. But it also means that, like, boy, we got to find those people because if we can't talk to them, we can't get the work, we can't get the materials to write about.
Oh yeah. And I know that it was on our radar now that our goals for putting up the exhibit are changing, depending on, what happens. I know that the curating team was toying with the idea of doing some sort of digital presentation presence. We were looking into academic publishing, just to give us more options of how to utilize all this research and all this work that we put into this project, that the end goal is changing. So I think that we would love to talk more about potentially doing something digital, obviously bringing more information to the general public and community, but seeing how we can build some sort of awesome web of Queer Nation stuff with you all.
Yeah, for sure.
My favorite thing to do is to talk about radical anti-assimilationism in the South and then throw up a picture from Queer Nation Houston, and it just says "cock-sucking faggot" on it. All over the city of Houston, right?
Oh yeah.
That's amazing.
Yes.
Right?
All of the literature from Queer Nation is so goddamn amazing. We were pulling so much from the Queers Read This, the Queer Manifesto. I mean, every line could be a section heading in an exhibit. It's a very, very awesome radical group. Yeah.
Well, Jen, tell us a little bit more about your social media, because you guys I feel like you're posting all the time.
Yes, I run our Instagram and our Facebook, so I still haven't gotten Hootsuite like we talked about. So it's still me in the morning, half awake, posting. So I need to work on it. But what you were saying about our exhibits meeting up, I feel like doing some sort of online exhibit or a booklet or something like that. I feel like every exhibit we do, I worked on the last one, which was on, it was our Lavender Women and Killer Dykes exhibit, which was all about lesbians and feminism in the 70s and 80s. And we did so much research, so much reading. We had way too much text on the wall, but that was still after we had cut almost half of the research we did. Yeah. And something that we could put into a book where people could read more about it after, and different people could contribute to it, so you could learn about that era in different cities. And I think that's something we could work on together that could be really, really great.
Yeah.
But yeah, the social media is, I feel like it's been fun. When I started doing it as a volunteer, I felt like I was just seeing so many things that I wanted to share. So it was great to be able to post pictures, or when other volunteers, like when James found a really great erotica tape that didn't have to be censored too heavily. That was great to post. It's been really, really fun starting things like Tilly Tuesday. There's a drag queen called Tilly, the Dirty Old Lady of Chicago, that we got her collection. And it felt very by chance that we got it. Someone came in after she died and said, I used to be friends with this drag queen, and I don't want to move these photo albums again. Do you want them? And we said, yes, we would like these. And it was like 4 photo albums from the 1940s through the 90s, just full of photos of her and her friends and all of this drag that had been happening in Chicago and some in Ohio as well. So we have all these photos, but very little information about any of the people in the photos. So it's been fun to post the pictures, and certain researchers, like Owen Keenan is this really incredible researcher who also has done work on the Belmont Rocks. I think he's working on a book about that right now. He's like a grassroots historian in Chicago. So he saw these pictures, and I saw him in the library the next week. He's like, well, I'm working on a book. I've been seeing these Tilly Tuesday pictures, and I want to know more about her. I was like, that's amazing. So like, that's been really fun to be able to share these pictures from collections that people don't know very much about. And I think we reach people, particularly younger people. I think when I started, and I think James would say the same thing, like when we both started, it was primarily a lot of older people that were coming in. And I think now there's a big mix of people, particularly with the volunteers. So that's been really wonderful to see that shift happen as well.
Mm-hmm.
Alyssa, I'm curious, like how much of the archival work that you're doing is, how much of it is like, because processing is always a problem. It's always happening. It never stops. But how much of what you're doing is donor work, or would you like to be doing more of that kind of work, like actually out, beating the bushes and looking for humans?
Oh God, yeah. A lot of the projects, are just based within Gerber Hart right now, because like you said, there's always a lot of backlog. There's always a lot of processing to be done. But in our particular case, there was a long period of time we did not have any sort of solid archivist on retainer. And the way that we were accessing records was changing constantly depending on who was sitting at the front desk. And we didn't have a lot of instructional manuals. We didn't have a lot of consistency. So for the past year, really, since I've been there consistently, I've been trying to implement those sort of standards that will help us not just in the present, but also, I'm not going to be there forever. As we move forward, that we can stay consistent with how we're accessing things. But I would so much love to do more like beat the bushes, like go around, try and do more development work, get people's collections actively, because I know there's so much out there that we're just not, people either don't know that we're around. Obviously, we're trying to combat that with how much we're posting on social media and doing things like this where we're connecting with other institutions. But it's such a particularly unique problem to have, where you just need to be able to scream from the rooftops that you're here to come give us stuff, and we'll take care of it, and we'll make sure that we're getting it to the researchers, students, and people that need it. So I would love to do more active collecting like that in the future. But right now we're so heavily focused on really maintaining and processing what we have. It's hard to wrap my head around having to do that, but we have such a dedicated volunteer group. So I know that we'll be able to do more of that in the future. I feel like we're on such a good path right now.
Yeah.
And even with all of this standstill that we've got going with COVID-19, I know that we're on a good road to getting bigger and getting more well known. It's really exciting.
It's been really great to see people. I think particularly with the exhibits, we've had more people kind of come out of the woodwork and, you know, offer to donate materials or answer questions that we have. And I think that's like what James mentioned. It's been interesting on these last few exhibits because a lot of the people are still around that we're doing this history on, which can be stressful as well as good.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, we've had people that have been very generous with sharing materials, so we've been able to have more accurate exhibits. I'm thinking of the lesbian and feminism exhibit. There was a group called Executive Suite that was a traveling party for women of color, and we knew it existed, but we didn't know much about it. But I was able to find someone who knew the founder. So we actually went down and interviewed her, the two founders, and they brought a whole binder full of materials from it. So it's Pat McCombs and Vera Washington. And we were able to go through and look at all of it. And then they came to the exhibit. Pat came to the exhibit opening, and like our exhibit would never have been able to be that good if we hadn't been able to make that connection. So it's trying to make more connections like that and hopefully find more people with materials to where we can keep growing our collection in a positive way.
Well, how can people find you if they want to find you?
We have a website, so gerberhart.org, and then we're on Instagram, gerberhart, so it's like the Gerber baby, and then HART. So we're on Facebook, on Instagram. You can email us as well. There's the info@gerberhart.org, or can I send you all my email so you could share it as part of this? Perfect.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, any interest in donating materials or figuring out more about our programming or people that want to collaborate, like we definitely want to hear from people.
Nice.
Oh yeah.
Well, any final thoughts that you guys want to share with folks before we part ways?
Do we all have a favorite thing that we've found in Gerber Hart in the collection? I know I have a particularly interesting.
That's a good question.
I'm getting nods. One of the most exciting things that I found, oddly enough, was not in the archive, although there's always interesting things to find in there. I was browsing our circulating collection, and I was really interested in some James Baldwin work, obviously. So I was going through his books, and I took one out, and I took it home, and I flipped past the title page, and oh wow, it's signed by James Baldwin. And I stared at the page, and I closed it, and I immediately brought it back and said, maybe we should not have this circulating. Obviously, once a book is stamped and like in a circulating collection, it loses all value. So while it does have some historical relevance, it's not monetarily important anymore. So that book is still circulating in our collection, and I love thinking that people will take out our copy of Another Country and see that it's signed by James Baldwin. I think that's a little nugget of gold that you can find if you come to Gerber Hart.
What about you, James?
I think one of my favorite sort of pieces that we discovered in the collection is we did one of our past exhibits, Out of the Closets and Into the Streets, which was sort of like post-Stonewall radical activism in the 70s. We were looking at people who were redefining gender norms. And there was this group of, I guess you'd call them drag performers, but they were more like interested in like gender fuckery, right? They weren't sort of like trying to go by any one thing, but they were called the Cycle Sluts. And I absolutely love them. They are a bunch of big hairy men who would show up to parties. There's this like great story about them showing up to a party at a big film producer's house in Los Angeles, like probably somewhere up on Mulholland Drive. And it's like this big deal party, and you've got, I think Julie Andrews was there, and like, I mean, you've got all these like celebrities, right? And this garbage truck that has been painted all black shows up, and out of the back of the garbage truck comes all these sort of like gender fuckery guys in like crazy makeup and huge beards and like mostly naked, and they just storm the party, like doing all the drugs and drunk out of their minds. And like they met Hugh Hefner at this party, and Hugh Hefner was like, oh, you got to come to the Playboy thing, you know. So this is like fascinating, hilarious thing. But some of the illustrations, we've scanned them, we'll have to send you one so you can see it. But some of the sort of promotional illustrations that were done for them are incredible, and they're beautifully drawn, but just these wild, like hilarious, fun, just super anarchic, you know, kind of pieces. It was just a blast. I was just like tickled. I actually want to get a tattoo of one of their designs.
What about you, Jen?
I'm glad Alyssa didn't go archives, because I think we share the same favorite archival collection. There's this very small collection called GALS, which is the Great Angling Lesbian Society, which is a lesbian fishing group. And it's so small and so niche, but there's like there's newsletters. I think there's personal ads that are like catch of the day. There's photos. I mean, it's like a one little box, but it's such incredible, like an incredibly specific group that I'm so happy that we have it. And there's even, I think one of the newsletters, they make a joke. It was in the 90s, and it was like, just wait, one of these days Gerber Hart will be asking for our papers, and it just cracks me up.
You know, queer people are like uncannily good at puns and acronyms. Like, that's our repertoire right there. We got it all locked down.
We are so witty.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I love the idea of a lesbian fishing group. That is just so spot on.
Well, and based in Chicago, so they had to travel. There were some field trips to find good spots for that. So.
Yeah, and the founder was a lesbian judge in Chicago, right? And we have some of her papers. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. So I think we could find her if we wanted to know more. I think I know how to get in contact.
Yeah, I think they were her and her partner, I believe, retired up to Minnesota, so they could fish all the time. What a love story.
I think one of our favorite things in the collection was a newspaper clipping that was dropped off. In 1984, Birmingham had its first openly lesbian candidate for mayor. And her platform was she ran as a self-identified socialist lesbian witch.
Oh, that's amazing.
And she got 3% of the vote.
Love it.
Which seems like a lot for a socialist lesbian witch.
Get her on the ballot now. I'll vote for her.
Seriously.
We need that lesbian witch energy in our lives.
Please.
I want that like campaign shirt for that.
Right.
She, like, all these folks are coming out with all these random lesbian movies right now. I swear, if we put this on YouTube and then all of a sudden there's a fishing lesbian love story on Netflix, we're calling it a day. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
Watch these gals. I don't know. I've run out of puns. I don't know. Reel them in. Reel them in.
You can't vote for fun ability and then not have one ready. Come on.
I know. The thing is I have no concept of time. I was going to say it's late, but it's not. But it's not early. It's just right smack in the middle of the day for my brain to be working. But there's a fucking pandemic. So there's my excuse.
There you go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank y'all so much for talking to us. If you want to check out anything at Gerber Hart, we'll have links to all the things in the description box, and you can check them out. And definitely check out their social media, especially their Instagram, because it is a lot of fun. And Jen is staying up at late at night to provide you with entertainment. So make sure that you make it worth it. All right. Thank y'all.